Welcome everyone to our deep dive on AI rollups. Is this VC with a twist or PE with a prompt? We are here today to talk about, the big hype and what happens if you flip the script on the industry and instead of trying to find that elusive product market fit, you buy businesses outright. And what if instead of trying to sell a fresh product to an old industry, you just buy that businesses in that old industry, embed your AI, and scale the margins from the inside out? That's the roll-up play. It's part private equity, part VC, and all about rebuilding old industries from within. But it's not as easy as it sounds. So we'll go through the good, the bad, and the ugly. What if the margin uplift doesn't show up? And what if the integrations get messy? And what about that exit strategy? So we're here to talk about all of this today. And we're joined by people who are actually in the trenches. It's my pleasure to introduce our guests, starting with Zeynep Yavuz from General Catalyst. The guys have been at the forefront of this thesis, as well as three founders who are pioneering and leading the charge in AI rollups in property, professional services, and staffing. So you're in the right place, guys, if you're here to learn about what all the hype is about, what's real, and what's next. I'll introduce our founders. Dan is the co-founder and CEO of Dwelly, a UK property rollup. Dan's the guy who's dragging UK property listings market into 21st century. And if you think real estate can't be automated, he's here to prove you wrong. Dwelly is actually one of the pioneers and leaders of this whole wave of AI rollups in Europe. And we'll definitely be looking to hear more from your experience in the trenches. Let me also intro David, who is a co-founder at Zinco AI, a professional services rollup in Spain. David is cracking the code in the market where tradition runs deep and tech adoption runs slow. Spain is not usually considered sort of the pioneer of a new AI trend, but David is here to lead the charge and doing it in the market, which most VCs, frankly, overlook. And finally, Leo Shangin is the founder and CEO of Pioneers, US outstaffing agency. And Leo is on a mission to reinvent America's oldest staffing rails with AI. And he's not afraid to take on the graveyard of a failed HR tech. So if you want to know how to actually automate people's businesses, Leo's your guy. My name is 𝗥𝗶𝗹-𝗨𝗨. I'm the co-founder and CEO of S16 VC. We're a founders fund with 100 million of capital under management, actively investing across the AI landscape, including AI roll-up opportunities. And this is what we're here to talk about today together. So let's get into it. And, by way of kind of kicking this off, when we first published our post with the webinar announcement, we expected that maybe, a few of our friends and relatives will join the party, and we'll keep it chill and informal. But we didn't expect that almost 400 listeners to jump in on a Friday night in the middle of July. So the topic has really hit the nerve here. And looking at the audience here today, we have a lot of investors from leading VC and private equity funds, as well as founders and operators. And I know a few folks in the audience who are actually in the trenches building or funding the upstart AI rollups. Okay, cool. So now with that out of the way, let's start with the high-level question. What makes an AI rollup and why now around this strategy? Rollup as a business model is a staple of private equity world. They've been around forever, probably since the 80s. In the VC world, we've had an emergence of tech-enabled rollups towards the tail end of ZERP in 2021. Notably the FBA wave. So maybe as a foundation question, let's unpack what AI rollup actually means, and we'll use the origin AI rollup story for each of our guests to do it here. So Zeynep, you guys at GC have been at the forefront of this. So maybe kick us off here on what's an AI rollup and what got you guys excited about this theme, the why now of it, to actually put together a whole separate strategy for this.
Of course, happy to. I'll maybe first say that what was really intentional here in terms of strategy was more AI, and it was AI transformation. So if you think about General Catalyst, we've been around for over 20 years. And in addition to our early stage venture and growth business, we also have a fund that is called the Creation Fund, where we incubate companies or help incubate companies. And a number of companies that you'll know of, like Kayak and Circle, Livongo, actually came out of this fund. So company building is very much in the DNA of General Catalyst. When AI happened, I think the first realization we had was that the biggest impact is going to be in services. The problem is that a lot of these services businesses not just run on legacy, but they don't really like buying software. And we also realize that for a lot of these services businesses, buying software is not necessarily going to completely transform them because it's not going to be the AI first mindset. So the way we got into the AI roll-ups was not with the roll-up mindset. It was with the AI transformation mindset. Then we started looking at these services, categories that we think AI will drive the biggest uplift and improvements. So real estate agencies, property management is one of them, accounting services, insurance brokerage, BPOs, and the list goes on. And when we started looking at these markets, we also realized something which private equity funds have known for some time, that these markets are super fragmented. And actually, these markets are a lot more fragmented in Europe than they are in the US because the private equity consolidation is a bit more advanced in the US than it is in Europe. So effectively, what kind of drove the roll-up thesis was first the AI transformation, then looking at these markets and realizing that the way to maybe drive value is to become a services business, be AI first, and then consolidate the market.
Like, what does the AI bring to the table? What's new with AI?
What we were looking for in these services businesses, we were really looking for workflows. We were looking for services businesses that are very text heavy. It requires manual work, people reviewing text or voice-based, so doing calls or filling out forms, for example. So that's why claims management made sense. That's why accounting made sense. That's why real estate agencies made sense, because it's a lot of calling and filling out things. So that's what we mean by AI, because not every services sector is being disrupted by AI the same way.
So we're talking automatable workflows, mundane automatable workflows. I want to maybe hand over to Dan. You've pioneered this model in Europe. So tell us the backstory. How did you get started, and how things evolved from maybe when you started to today in terms of market perception on the investor side, on the customer side, and on the target side?
I think that kind of our story was a little bit different. I'm sure that we'll spend quite a lot of time thinking of the thesis more from the kind of financial standpoint, but the way that we came across here was kind of slightly different. Our backgrounds, kind of we're three founders here, as some of you might know, and our backgrounds primarily being kind of across tech-enabled kind of services, effectively. Would it be Uber's, would it be 𝗥𝗏𝗧𝗏, where we've been GMs before, and effectively my co-founders after that has already once built, ran, and then sold successfully. What kind of served as the foundation for this business that was a tech-enabled letting agency in Eastern Europe. And the way that we were coming across that is effectively kind of what are the other kind of huge operational markets that are in a way kind of two-sided marketplaces that are highly fragmented both on demand side and supply side, and that are crazy huge operational businesses, but that are lacking technological adoption. These were rather our criteria, how we were looking at that. And then obviously kind of with all the previous experience of tech-enabled marketplaces, it was pretty clear that kind of the rental business, or kind of letting agencies as they call it in the UK, or estate agents, is definitely kind of one of those and ripe for disruption. Put aside that I think for most of the people kind of living in Europe and in the UK specifically, and I think that interacted with an experience of the kind of estate agency or letting agency, I think quite a lot of people were saying that experience is subpar and clearly can be kind of brought more to the standards of the kind of tech world of 21st century. And it was rather kind of what was driving us. But I think that then when we started looking kind of deeper in the market, this is kind of yet another two-sided marketplace where you have a tenant, you have a landlord, but effectively kind of this whole business is not about how to kind of get the tenants, because it's comparatively kind of easy part. It's all about how to grow the landlords. And then when analyzing kind of the market, specifically kind of here in Europe, it became very clear that the only scalable way to grow is actually to start acquiring this kind of agencies, because that's the only way to kind of to unlock the accessible supply, that otherwise organic growth is very slow because the landlords are very sticky and their kind of organic retention with the given businesses is very, very high. So effectively kind of we came across the idea of let's build a tech-first platform, but effectively let's start buying up this kind of agencies effectively to buy the managed contracts portfolios, and then effectively be putting those on the kind of tech rails to achieve the same kind of goals. service effectively, improve level of service, and obviously kind of enable the agents with better tools and increase its efficiency. So I think that we weren't thinking in the terms at all of like, this is VC play, this is kind of private equity play. It was like an idea that logically made sense for us, and it felt like this is worth pursuing. Yes, we knew that there is the kind of a known private equity consolidator play on the end of acquiring agencies and then just obviously absorbing some synergies on one end, but they usually do not empower the business with technology. There is on the other end tech-enabled play where organic growth, but organic growth is highly limited. And we just felt that there is an opportunity to merge the best of these two worlds and kind of go after that. I think to kind of your second question, I think that we were in a way kind of just lucky to kind of start a bit ahead of when it became a bit more of a trend, because like we initially started doing that in kind of very beginning of 2023, middle 23, long before it was like a big wave or a big trend. And I think that back to your kind of fundraising point, for example, kind of when we just started, I think that the thesis of you can start acquiring businesses and enable them with technology, you come with this thesis to kind of typical venture capital investors, and they're saying market is huge, market is outdated, it's crying for disruption, it's great, ticks all the boxes. The only moment you say the world I will be start acquiring and roll up, usually kind of they roll their eyes, pun intended, and effectively kind of don't want to engage conversation further, right? And start finger pointing you to PE guys. You come to PE guys, they're saying, I mean, that's great, roll up, even originate from scratch, we're happy to do that, but tech transformation is not something that we're happy to engage, right? Go talk to VCs. And I think that we were eventually kind of in the very beginning sort of falling exactly in between these two cracks. And I think that when we just started in middle 2023, we were kind of, I think, turned down by something around kind of 100 or 150 VCs that, yeah, I think at the moment it wasn't that much of a thing effectively. So had to kind of not just talk the talk, but effectively buy the first assets and prove it by the factual results and like a bit walk the walk.
Leo, now is a good time for you to step in. So you actually bring a unique angle here, which may be particularly relevant for founders in the audience, because you're a serial entrepreneur and you came into this roll-up world by taking your SaaS product into roll-up space. So tell us a little bit about what made you do that and how it's going.
I wouldn't say we brought our SaaS product, but we didn't start as a roll-up either. Like from the very beginning, we wanted to start a service business just because we realized that the HR tech market is overcrowded. So we decided not to build a software business, but instead we wanted to build a service business. So we wanted to build a staffing agency, highly automated one, powered by our own software. So we started as a service business. And at that time, a lot of VCs didn't understand our thesis either, but we just realized that we do have so many things to worry about. So the VC perception shouldn't be the one. For us, it just made sense. So we started doing that. And then at some point, when the business grew to a certain point, we realized that more efficient and more faster way for us to grow would be to acquire traditional staffing businesses instead of just growing organically. So we made one acquisition. We didn't even think about becoming a roll-up, but then I talked to Don, and Don told me about this whole AI roll-up thing. So we ultimately realized that we are AI roll-up, but it just happened. We didn't think about it at first. Yeah, it worked pretty well with the first agency. So we decided to acquire another one. And now we are about to acquire two more. It all happened organically. It all, like each step of the journey made sense to me. I think perception doesn't really matter here as long as the fundamentals work in terms of growth rate, efficiency and margins and all that. So that's how we...
Or if you had to isolate like one key reason to go from organic growth motion to roll up with AI sort of motion, what was it for you?
For us, it's speed and efficiency. It's much faster way for us to grow. And economically, it's just cheaper for us to acquire new clients this way rather than to invest significant amounts of money into sales and marketing.
How big were you when you actually turned sort of the M&A machine on?
At the time of our first acquisition, we had about 3 million in run rate revenue.
And David, now that you stepped in, let's move over to you. I think it's fair to say you guys are the youngest kid on the block. And I think what's remarkable is that you've made your first acquisitions with your own money, if I can share that. So tell us a little bit about that hustle, right? Like first how you got into it, but also how did you manage to buy first businesses before ever attracting any investors?
Yeah, so it was a little bit of equity. There was a little bit of bank debt. We also convinced sort of the owner with a very big chunk of vendor loan. And then we also basically did a little bit of equity rollover. And I think it was a little bit of hustle, basically through referrals, nothing sort of like professionalized. We basically talked to 100 accounting firms within 3 weeks. So basically doing around like 10 meetings a day. And it was a mix of finding the right people that really sort of basically bought our vision. And that basically made us that the person basically financed a big chunk of sort of us stepping in, together with also basically convincing the banks that this was an asset that we were able to basically going to be able to return the money. For that, we actually had to get a third party guaranteed from the vast country that like, no, because everybody was like, no fucking way that you guys, like any bank is going to give you guys money. You have zero track record. You just created a new entity. So we were able to basically hack it just by talking within a week with like the 20 sort of like debt providers that we had in Spain. And then also basically Alvaro and I basically chipped in our own money, and we basically also got the first owner reinvested into the business, and he actually has an equity, which was also a very big sort of topic and discussion, because imagine like someone that doesn't understand sort of valuations. He's like, okay, you're giving me equity, but like what valuation? You guys don't have anything. The only thing you have is sort of like my business. So it was a lot of basically having that sort of emotional intelligence to be able to connect with the person, to basically sold them into our vision. Because to Dan's point, Leo's point, Zeynep's point, like we didn't join and sort of like started this business because we were in love with AI transformation or because we were in love with M&A. We were basically trying, and we really had a vision of sort of like fixing a customer experience that was actually broken. And when you actually have that vision, you also have a path of like, how are you going to get there? You're able to bring people on board, which is basically what happened with us on sort of that first acquisition. And I think that's very, very important, because like when you're starting, like any startup, even if you're doing M&A, I think you need to be that person that's basically breaking walls, that's actually hustling. I think that's basically one of the best learnings that I think the three of us share here. Like even if it's M&A, even if it's you're going very fast because of that sort of like inorganic and those acquisitions, you're still basically needing to break walls, because the day-to-day of actually running a startup at the speed of what it means to run sort of a startup that eventually actually is VC backed, I think it is very similar. This is just a very different go-to-market. Instead of basically hiring a sales team, you're basically doing it through a different sort of like go-to-market.
Yeah, absolutely. So that combination of VC expectations on the return with the additional layer of M&A and integrating culture, etc. So we'll definitely talk about it in the challenges part of today's discussion. But before we move over to get our hands dirty there, I want to dive a little bit deeper into what's required for an AI roll-up play to succeed in the real world. And I want to start with the question of boundary conditions. And let me maybe, Zeynep, try you again. When you think about industries, and I think you've started touching that, you've talked about professional services, what makes certain industries or markets roll-upable, if that could be a term, and which do you avoid, if any?
So I'm going to approach this like without the AI perspective, more with the roll-up and the services perspective. So the level of fragmentation matters, and that can happen in two ways. So one of them is the market could be already consolidated. And we see this in some markets, especially in the US, that to get started with the AI transformation, instead of doing a roll-up, what we kind of need to do is buy one large player because the market is already consolidated. On the other extreme, the markets where it doesn't work is the very fragmented markets.
That's interesting. That's an interesting take. So super fragmented markets also don't work. Why is that?
So if you think about, particularly if it's an advisory business, and it's super fragmented. And I'll give some examples there. Like when it's super fragmented, the consolidation is also much harder. For example, you'll have firms that are 1 to 2 accountants. It'll be 1 to 2 people. This also happens quite a lot in wealth. So wealth advisory, there will be teams of like 2 to 3, and the majority of the market will be that fragmentation. And it's actually really hard to do a roll-up strategy there. And more importantly, rather than doing a roll-up, you can do a hiring strategy. So effectively, instead of rolling up these companies, what you do is that you hire the best advisors that you see in the market, and they bring over their books. What's important there is, in addition to the level of fragmentation, when you buy a company, what do you buy? Because some of the businesses that you buy, the customer contracts will be with the business. Sometimes it will be with the advisor. That's another very important distinction, because when you do a roll-up, you want to make sure, ideally, that the contracts are with the business, because often the reason you do the roll-up is to acquire the customer base.
And what are some of the most exciting industries that you guys are backing the AI roll-up plays in?
We have a number of them and they're public as well. So for example, we've got 𝗥𝗶𝗹𝗹 in the customer service category. We have investments in accounting in Germany. We have investments in real estate agencies and property management. We have investments in the MSP, managed service provider space. And a few other spaces that we're exploring are BPO category. This can be in insurance, TPA, claims management. Again, if you think about all the sectors that I'm saying, it's very kind of text-heavy manual workflows. We have legal is an interesting category. So these are just to name a few.
And it sounds like most of them are in the B2B, in the B2B space. Does anyone have on the panel any sort of views on kind of B2B versus B2C in terms of when you guys were evaluating the theses? I think some of you are actually kind of a bit in both.
I do have sort of like strong views here because I do think for roll-ups to actually work, there needs to be two things. One, I think, or if you're going to be highly sort of like reliant on sort of M&A, you need to make sure that there's a little bit more fragmentation. So I'm a little bit contrarian to Zeynep's point here, but she also doesn't like Spain, so she invests in Germany, so it's fine. And I think that's very important because like multiples can go up very quickly, sort of in an industry that is already sort of very consolidated and where there's a scarcity by default. And I think the second point is also sort of on the unit economics. So I think at the end of the day, if you're going to finance everything with equity because you have a lot and you have big pockets, which is fine. If you're not, because you need to be a little bit more scrappy and you're basically going to be using non-dilutive instruments, you need to ensure sort of that you have like the more recurring revenue, high margins is much better to sort of finance that way. And I think that usually happens much more on B2B than on the B2C side, where you can have probably like a little bit more like basically less predictability sort of on the churn side, less predictability on sort of like any sort of like usually like macroeconomic trend can actually completely kill you, and you could be because of the depth, right? I think that's actually sort of for example what happened on sort of like non-very successful roll-ups like the FBA aggregators, right, which were very reliant sort of as well on consumer demand, and sort of that revenue basically went away very quickly.
Dan, do you agree with that? I mean, you guys are sort of in B2C now.
The way I think about it, not exactly B2C versus B2B. I think that roll-ups is not a new thing, right? It's maybe we're sitting here and discussing it slightly more from the venture angle, but that's where I think that out of all the private equity capital that in the world, for example, I think is 20x of that of VC capital. I think that all mid-market PEs are like something around 10 trillion of capital of dollars, where all VC is like $500 billion, right? So it's like multiples more bigger category. I think that the world roll-ups and consolidation is a very known world. To me, I think that the tectonic shift of the AI appearance helps to distinguish the industries in between two angles, but from slightly different perspective. I think that there is industries that fall under one camp where effectively what you're acquiring is the kind of revenues, but also that most of the costs that do produce these revenues are also kind of revenue equals cost effectively. So kind of you will talk about all the typical kind of bread and butter PE roll-ups such as dental clinics, vet firms, GP practices, care clinics, funeral homes, like, and onwards, right? Where I would say that the tectonic shift of the AI kind of application is not driving maybe that much of a change for the consumer, and equally as not much of like in a way and efficiency that can be happening. Where to me the second category of industries is I think where what you buy is primarily rather sort of like a digital contract, and then you can do a lot of things about it. And I think this is all the industries that we've been talking about here and that Zeynep mentioned before: accounting, tax advisories, law firms, insurance, mortgage brokers, I mean partly maybe wealth management, recruitment services, right? Where kind of what you buy is highly sticky revenues, but then the provision of this revenues on the service level is in a way decoupled from kind of the revenue accretion and from the revenue recurrency itself. It's just I'm not an investor, so it's my kind of a bit of a sideline view, but given that we do kind of see some of the other roll-ups happening, because I think that some earlier founders kind of reaching out for advice from time to time, that's kind of in a way my interpretation how things kind of structured in these two camps. That is not exactly the B2C versus B2B perspective, but rather kind of how to look at it from which industry to start.
I'm actually going to ask the same question myself, because obviously we look at AI roll-ups as an investor, and we are trying to develop a set of what we'd call boundary conditions, how we think about them. And it's sort of, a roaming search where we continue to evolve our view. But It's definitely service businesses that seem the most exciting. And for the reason they seem the most exciting for us is actually for the similar reason that Zeynep mentioned, which is the workflows, the automatable workflows where you can drive that AI margin uplift. The other piece of it, when we talk sort of from a market structure standpoint, is the fragmentation, but not just fragmentation on the service provider, meaning business provider side that you're buying these businesses, but also fragmentation on the customer side. Because if you're buying up businesses that, small SMEs that, let's say, are serving several large key customers and have really high revenue concentration, then ultimately your success as a business is still at the mercy of these big customers. Then we also look for the efficient capital structure. So obviously for any roll-up play, leverage is a big part of the story. But to have a leverageability in play, you need to have cash flows, you need to have sticky revenue, and you don't want to have a lot of capex involved. So that's sort of like initial boundary conditions. I would say the other one is in the world where, cost of software creation, rapidly goes to zero. It's probably less about the ability to automate the workflows, but rather how fast you automate them versus your traditional old school on the ground competitors. And there, it almost seems like if you're entering an industry where the average age of an owner of a small business is like 50 plus, that's much better than trying to automate something where basically people are just of the same generation to you. Now, obviously, one of the key differences between us as investors and founders is that we as investors, we get to pick and choose different sectors again and again. But as a founder, once you select the market, that's it, you're married. And we all know that in marriage, there's a lot of surprises. I want to turn it over to the founders and ask, what are the aspects of your industry that you operate in that you believe most people don't understand, make it a great candidate for AI roll-up model?
No, so I think like in any sort of like M&A play in general, like I think the biggest sort of bottleneck I would say to actually bring AI on top is the level of integration that you're able to do. And with that, it's not necessarily only like processes, systems, but it's actually people. Last night, we actually did sort of the first meetup of the 3 companies that we've acquired to date, because we're basically rolling out and we're moving everybody to the same office in a couple of weeks. And it was very interesting. On the one side, you see a 30-year-old that is using ChatGPT, even himself actually trying to automate a lot of what he already does today. So he basically can actually take on more work and work less. And then on the other side, basically you have a 55-year-old person that I gave her a computer 1 week ago and still needs to call the IT guy to be able to actually switch it on. And I think that sort of mixes of cultures of people that you're integrating, if you really sort of like want to bring AI, sort of standardize those workflows that we're all talking about. I think the biggest question is like, what do you do with sort of like this people and culture integration? And I think it's basically a mix of doing it on the companies you're acquiring. So I think we actually do spend a lot of time to make sure that we can basically identify, hey, who actually has the talent that aligns much more with our culture and our vision, because like the velocity at which we implement is going to be very much sort of like driven by the people that you have there. And then I think secondly, just making sure that you have a very high bar and like whoever, and I talked about this with Dan as well, like I think, and he was very clear, like, dude, if someone doesn't work, out, and making sure that you actually, so right now, actually, we spend a lot of our time basically hiring to make sure that we're bringing people that do want to sort of like see that they want to be sort of part of this vision, and they understand that they need to basically use all of these tools to make sure that we become a much greater, much stronger company, not only because of the margins, but because we're actually going to be delivering a much better customer experience, because they're going to be able to focus on high quality, high value added work.
What was the biggest surprise for you once you got in the trenches and how the industry operates and how that affected your business? So kind of going from Excel to real life.
Yeah, I was going to say that I didn't expect that much travel, to be honest. I thought it's going to be a tech startup with some M&A, a little bit of it, but we spend about 60% of our time, not in our HQ, but somewhere else, spending time with the companies we acquire. And my role as a founder has completely changed as well. I guess I spend about 50% of my time on M&A and 50% of my time working on implementation and operations and all that. So it's highly operational business, and the role of the founders, the role of the core team have changed completely when we started doing the roll-up.
Tell us about that change. So what changed? Like much more operational people to people?
Pretty much, yeah. I only spent, I guess, 25-30% of my time in our office, and then we fly all around the country to companies that we potentially can acquire, to the companies that we already acquired, to the point that David mentioned, it's a people business. So we spend a lot of time with the teams of the companies that we acquire and all that. The M&A is very time consuming as well. So we spend a lot of time evaluating those companies. It's not like you hire an investment bank and they do everything for you. It doesn't work like that. You spend a lot of time evaluating those companies, talking to founders and stuff like that. So that's, I guess, the most significant change that I have noticed.
Maybe I'll talk a little bit then, or maybe first a war story from you, and then we'll pivot to the next topic.
I think that kind of the core of the business is in going as deep as you can into understanding the nitty-gritty details of how the business is run, reconstruct it to the kind of most granular kind of atoms effectively, and then kind of reassemble it back with what the business can look like with the kind of adoption of the most modern kind of cutting-edge technologies. This is what effectively this business is all about. And I think that with that mindset, as much as you can achieve from sitting in an office and like making an assumptions about how specific industry is done, I think it's just would be only partial and kind of close to impossible to get right what the product should look like whenever you don't kind of see it in details and in trenches. And I think that necessarily makes the kind of, in a way, quality and the alignment of the mindset on this first acquisition is just foundational for the business.
Alignment with the previous owner.
Alignment on the vision and alignment on what's about to happen. Because effectively, you are to preserve two roles effectively. You are to preserve the role of day-to-day running the business, number one, and number two, of like reconstructing it to atoms, recollecting it back, and while building the technology to power that. So it's like changing engines of the kind of airplane on the fly, like with really, it exactly feels like that. And that's why I would say that on this first business, it's not just kind of buying the business. It's effectively the kind of cornerstone of the whole roll-up story, effectively, based on which you kind of building the technology, operational know-how, and the processes as well. So I think that appreciation of the importance of this first acquisition is just fundamental. And I think that we've been lucky with that regard to kind of find the first business that was actually kind of 4 hours north of London, and with no hesitation together with the founders, we just packed our stuff, took kind of our families and moved over there, because I think it's just worth it. This is kind of the only way to do that. And you need to be kind of in the trenches and you need to be on the ground.
Well, let's move towards the actual nitty-gritty and talk a bit about those first acquisitions. And I want to maybe start with then where you left off, which is the alignment question. It's generally be great to hear in terms of how to structure relationships with the outgoing owners, right? Like, where is the optimal role which you found they can play, and where is the right way to do it? And what do you think is a wrong or a risky way to do it?
I think that kind of building on top of what I've just mentioned, I think it's fundamentally different stories of the kind of first businesses that you're buying and of the kind of effectively additional acquisitions whenever kind of some of your operational know-how and technology is already built. But one thing I would say is that I think that, and this is what we've been talking a lot about, kind of FBA roll-ups and some other roll-ups that didn't work out. I think that the only kind of things that kill kind of this sort of roll-up is going after the wrong deals. I think that it's either kind of buying things at the kind of multiples that are not justifiable and don't make sense, or start kind of raising crazy amount of capital and hence loosening your controls of what you're buying. I think that these are the things that kill the business. Kind of you should continue for a very long period of time focusing on highly quality businesses that can effectively kind of be the foundational for kind of for what you're building. And I think that in every specific industry, I think that what this quality implies would be very different, measured by its own kind of criteria of what quality implies. But I would say that kind of this is, I think, one of the core things, kind of coming back to your question. How to then structure kind of, it's usually would be that the key reason to sell an agency by the kind of the person that is like selling it, an agency in our case, or kind of accounting firm or recruitment agency. Yes, it would be retirement quite often. But I think that this is then effectively feeds back into this criteria of quality effectively, because after the person is kind of leaving the business potentially, it's what would justify kind of if the business is kind of to be run forward or kind of would start naturally declining over time.
Any further thoughts here on how to build this relationship with the owners, like to keep them in the business, or do you just take the reins and run as fast as possible?
I think we basically see two main reasons why sort of like one of the owners actually wants to sort of sell us the business. One is because of generational succession issues. So like, hey, I have kids or I don't have kids, but basically no one can actually take over the business. And those people, the way we do it is we try to get get them out of the business within a year, but in a degraded way. They still basically, we take all of the admin first and all of the things that actually they don't usually want to do. So like from like the actual, their own accounting, their own sort of like HR, their own sort of like people management, like all those things in the first like basically, well, even less, in like 2 to 3 months. And then basically from the second year onwards, we just leave them and degrade sort of with a small salary to ensure that they're still engaged with the business. And we can basically use them, first of all, to sometimes go to like new client meetings, because they do actually bring a lot of sort of like power to those meetings, or to even sort of go to sort of other potential acquisition meetings. But we also see a second type of person that is actually joining, which is, for example, like our second acquisition. He wanted to jump because he's like, man, the industry is going to consolidate. The only way to keep up sort of with the customer demand and with the technology and implementing processes is if I consolidate into a bigger group. I cannot do it together, but I'm 38 years old. And then he was like, and from there, I actually want to choose who's the best partner. He talked to everybody and he's like, oh, okay, you guys are basically people that are more aligned with my culture, more aligned with my vision. You're actually tech people, not the people that are consolidating either because they come from the industry or because they're private equity backed. But it's very interesting also that second type of founder who's like, man, this industry needs to change 100%. I can't keep up sort of with the amount of technology that I actually need to implement. And I know it's going to happen. So I want to join sort of the best horse in the race.
I actually want to talk a little bit about the technology implementation piece that David, you just mentioned, and particularly the sort of the buy versus build question. Some of this goes to like the very root of what a tech, very center of what can you call an AI startup or a tech startup in 2025, which is, do you build your own tech or do you actually automate workflows using other people's tech, other AI agents? And as a corollary to that, if you are essentially just, let's say you focus on implementing existing software that already exists, you just do a better job at implementation in the workflows, how are you different from any other roll-ups already competing who also have access to the same software? So it's sort of like the software piece of it and the buy versus build. Inherently, are you a product company or are you a workflows automation company?
For key features of the software, we're trying to build everything internally. And the key reason behind it is that we need to make sure that we can implement our product fast. And in order to do that, the product needs to be as flexible as possible. So whenever we acquire the company, we need to make sure that we implement key features within the first 1-2 months at max. So, and in order to do that, we might try some third-party products first, just to understand whether or not the whole approach works, but then we're trying to build everything internally. So all the main features of our product, whether it comes to sourcing candidates or screening candidates or interviewing, all that's the main features that we have. We've built that internally just to make sure that we have enough flexibility to implement it fast. To your second question, how are we different from more traditional, like large staffing firms that can implement AI products as well?
Or PE roll-ups in the same space as well, that are, just buying, let's say, a set of tools and just implementing in the same pipeline.
I think it's a question of culture. Like for large companies to change that fast, they need to change the culture and they need to change like a lot of operational processes within the company. It's a similar question to why, Blockbuster couldn't become Netflix or why Walmart couldn't become Amazon. It's pretty similar to that. You need to make so many changes. You need to change people. You cannot really change people. You need to be AI first company. So we still consider ourselves as a product company. So product goes first. Obviously, M&A is a huge part of the business, but product is what makes us different.
I think that's great. Maybe, David, let's go over to you. Are you guys a product company or are you an automations company?
I think today it looks like much more like an automations company, but the vision, the culture, and what we're trying to create is a product business, I think. And that's sort of where the difference is going to be from a great sort of like PE-backed roll-up outcome to an actually VC type of outcome. I think what you need to be able to do that is to be able to prove that you're going to be able to develop a data product that actually has network effects. Because with only margin expansion, I think this doesn't work. This is going to get you a 30, 40x, amazing. But if you really want to go for that sort of like 100x return, you really need to make sure that you transition completely and change the unit economics and the type of business that you're doing with network effects to be able to have organic growth. Because I think like M&A is an amazing sort of like go-to-market, but the reality is it gets to a point that it doesn't bring you that exponentiality to be able to keep on increasing your return. So it's an amazing way to start. But if you're going to be depending from M&A in 8 years from now, you're basically not going to be able to grow as much. And therefore, you're not going to be able to get sort of that multiple expansion. So we want to be a product company. Today, we automate a lot of workflows and we're more like a workflow automation company. And for that, we do build build some stuff in-house, and there's some other stuff, like every single SaaS on the planet, even if you're a pure tech play, there's some stuff that you need to do existing, you need to basically use existing tools as well, because like developing a whole, we've implemented Aircall, like creating basically like a call system, it's probably very stupid and a very bad use of our time. So we're trying to basically also implement stuff that's already out there, but with that mentality of building everything tailored, verticalized, to make sure that we solve for our specific nitty-gritty sort of day-to-day workflows.
I want to double click into what you mentioned about data. The first time we mentioned data in this call. Yes. What do you mean by data? Do you mean a data mode, or do you mean structured data versus unstructured data in terms of actually being able for AI to make some use out of it? What do you have in mind there?
No, a data product. So I think like today, basically all of that data, it's either not being even stored or it's not being looked at. But the reality, for example, in accounting is you actually have the bank transactions, the invoices, the actual sort of payroll. So you have a lot of data of the company and you have a huge historical amount of data of those businesses that is not being utilized. So I think you can create data products around it, being able to exploit all of that data that has actually been created to offer them more SaaS-like type of products, which do have those network effects and that can improve. I'm thinking on the payroll side. So we do think eventually, how do we build a data product for those guys? So how do we do salary benchmarking products?
So you kind of move towards like consulting and essentially start eating away higher margin or automating away higher margin tasks that they need to do, more like consulting tasks.
Totally. Yes.
Got it. Well, then you mentioned you were building product company from day one, but where do you arguably, you started a little bit before. So maybe reflect for us on your journey of buy versus build software and what is essential here for the playbook?
Yeah, I have kind of quite a strong view on that. We're clearly building an AI first product company first and foremost. The way that I'm looking at that is that this is kind of an AI first company where for us acquiring the business is primarily effectively just buying customers in a bulk at a predefined customer acquisition cost. You can then go and put this kind of marketing dollars on Google to buy these customers one by one, but it just wouldn't scale. So you can buy the business with just a bulk of customer acquisition cost effectively. And that's kind of the way I look at it. All of these businesses, would it be accounting, would it be recruitment, would it be any other categories, clearly are run on some sort of CRMs today. But the challenge of the CRMs sell and distribution is that kind of you as a kind of B2B SaaS company end up having to build a very flexible set of technological tools because kind of all these business services businesses are first and foremost operational businesses. And you would never find two businesses that are even kind of powered on the same CRM, but that would be using the CRM in the same way because they rather would be kind of operations first company and then using its kind of CRM software to power its operations and not other way around. So effectively you as a kind of B2B SaaS distribution end up building kind of a Frankenstein of very flexible different tools that then different businesses would be using in completely different nature. And that's the reason why kind of using any off-the-shelf kind of technologies just naturally limits you because I mean specific examples. In our case, there are, for example, specialized kind of payment reconciliation payment tools because in our kind of case, it's effectively about kind of agency collecting rent, reconciling for the kind of accounts receivable from the tenant, and then paying out to the landlord. And obviously, kind of in all of the Western world, there is a solution to that called direct debit that effectively kind of serves as the kind of just collecting rent and paying out just all in one go. There are some kind of specialized payment CRMs that purposefully disable the auto reconciliation of funds, even though that's the whole logic of the direct debit. Because, for example, some customers then coming up and saying, you know what, I want control before I disburse the funds. I want to look the whole list and kind of disburse it. So kind of they naturally have to even disable some of the embedded automation functionality just to provide for this flexibility. So that's why I think that using any of the shelf tools is just possible, but would limit your opportunities of kind of the great customer experience quite significantly. And that's why I think that kind of whenever there are some, let's say, private equity backed roll-ups kind of look at that, that's why kind of in my viewpoint, again, Zeynep and yourself are obviously much better at kind of comment on that. But I think that's why it's like a novel business model that in a way picks up a bit of features of the best of the two worlds. Because like on one end, investing in this proprietary technology, even when you are kind of quite a consolidated already private equity backed company, to build a software, to adopt it then, to do the kind of some inside out transformation of the business would take you years to accomplish. And then imagine you're kind of a private equity owner of these assets that is not really kind of having much of an appetite for risk, but actually kind of just want in a way some stable sort of return, right? Would would it fit with the mandate of your kind of 4 or 5 years kind of investment? Would you recoup your investments of this like fixed period holding window where you need to do as much of an investment that might take you just this 4 or 5 years to continue investing, and you already need to sell off your asset and return back the funds to the LPs? So to me, it's like partly about the misalignment of incentives of some of the owners and technological tools that power some of these assets that almost like structurally doesn't allow for some of the off-the-shelf kind of products to produce as much of a kind of both efficiency as well as improvement in user experience.
Well, let's actually hear from Zeynep. Zeynep, you guys, I'm sure you have thought a lot about sort of the buy versus build, the product piece of it versus the workflows piece of it, and really maybe even the big story, right? Like for these companies. So in terms of the vision. So when you guys evaluate, and I'm sure you evaluate, so many AI roll-up pitches, maybe talk us through your thought process in terms of how critical this buy versus build decision is. Are you backing product companies or more like traditional roll-ups? And what are some of the best of the breed examples that you've seen of how this tension is resolved?
From an investing perspective, 100% we're backing product companies. So that's why when I kind of opened with the way we got into this industry, it was really AI transformation first and roll-ups second, just because of the market structure. Not even necessary, really. We're really focused on the AI transformation side of things more than the roll-ups. So we're very open to investing in companies that want to build services businesses that will have an AI transformation angle. When I think about the thing that matters the most, it's the team. The team matters a lot, of course, in every investment that we do, but it matters even more in this category. Because if you think about building an AI roll-up, first of all, you need a really good technical leader who's going to be building the technology and the processes. Then you're going to have a very strong financial leader and a strategist who will be looking into this market, identifying acquisition opportunities. And then you need to have a very strong leader who's going to be doing the operations and the integrations. And the three of these, like effectively, these three personas need to be working extremely closely together because all of this is happening at once. In the classic startup journey, what you have initially is you build the product, then the go-to-market starts to matter, you have product market fit. It's quite different.
You don't need the CFO at the seed stage startup.
Exactly. And you need the operations also, because most of the time, if you're going into building of these workflows, one of the things you realize is that if you build the workflows without actually being the services company or owning the asset, you're building the wrong stuff. So sometimes it actually makes sense to first do the acquisition, then build up the tech, which is why this becomes like a really difficult thesis to execute, both from a funding perspective, but also from a delivery perspective. Just to say that for us, the team matters the most. And this is what we're looking to see in the team.
What about the big vision?
So on the big vision, I like all the comments regarding, the data moat, the network effects. Network effects is the right mindset. When I think about it structurally, the thing that matters is organic growth. Funny thing is that we're not doing organic growth, right? We're doing inorganic growth. And actually, we're targeting markets where organic growth just doesn't work because either the sales are super high touch or the contracts are for many years. So therefore, you cannot switch them over. So in the case of real estate, for example, as Dan knows well, because we can't drive organic growth, we pursue inorganic growth. But the idea here is that in this market where it's very hard to do organic growth, if you offer a service that is clearly superior to the rest of your competition, you will start driving organic growth. And this is why AI transformation is incredibly key to the whole strategy, because the only way that you can really deliver better service is through automating things. When we do these investments, EBITDA margin improvement is not really the target. That's not what we care about. What we care about is idle time that's created for our employees and how that idle time can now be put into work.
What sort of economics are we looking at? Are we targeting? Maybe are you guys want to see from the effect of these changes and how the math stacks up? Maybe you can, are there some rule of thumbs that you use? Maybe it's not all about EBITDA margin uplift as a sort of the core point, but the math still needs to work, right?
The math, though, is not on EBITDA. The core number that we track and many of our portfolio companies track, and I'm sure everyone on the call tracks, is time saved per workflow. So you look at your employees and what they were doing, and after you deploy the automation, how much time it took them to complete the same task. That is a lot more important to us than the EBITDA margin improvement. And if you think about it, yes, it can correspond, but what we care about is time saved so that the employees can effectively now dedicate that time into more meaningful tasks.
While Zeynep is thinking, Oleg, what is the craziest idea that came by your table?
I've had, since we've published a webinar, a lot of people come in with different roll-up businesses that they are thinking, hey, we're a roll-up business. Can we become an AI roll-up business? And these have been absolutely illuminating conversations. I think some of the folks who we spoke with are actually at the call today as well. But one thing specifically that I've taken away from these is that one place where AI roll-ups may not work as well is where the share of cost that can be automated as a percentage of total cost in the business isn't very high. So if we take traditional PE-backed roll-up place like dentistries or vet clinics and stuff like that, there are typically three key sources of cost, and that's the cost of the doctor, the cost of the rent, and the cost of the medicine. There isn't that much to automate there. And so you're a bit stuck with like a four-wall EBITDA. I wouldn't call these crazy. I would just say that some industries are probably more challenging than others for this play to work. I don't know. I would be hard. They never came to me, but it would be hard for me to imagine AI roll-up and hair salons.
I have to say that everything that has come to our desk, we haven't had anything that's effectively like it would be a robotics approach, right? If we're thinking about replacing workflows that are by human. I'll say this though, one interesting anecdote. The fact that we were doing this AI roll-up strategy was more public. Obviously, I started getting a lot of inbound as we lead the strategy in Europe. And people were really focused on the roll-up side. And a number of people are actually doing roll-ups in services that they think cannot be disrupted by AI. So effectively, when these pitches come to me, I'm like, okay, actually, no, we're not in the roll-up business. We're in the AI transformation business. So we're not going to be the right fit. But actually, building a business perspective, it makes a lot of sense to focus on the categories that are, where the human involvement is absolutely necessary. And the other thing that we have observed in the market is that private equity investors have also completely shifted to that. So a lot of PE firms that are very focused on services are in a way shying away from the categories that they know AI will disrupt because they don't know exactly how to play that game and don't know how fast it's going to happen. So now there's a premium for things that AI will not be disrupting up until robotics, I guess, is more advanced.
Who is the buyer for these businesses in the future? In terms of the end game, the pushback is that most niches cannot be sufficiently consolidated to become IPO worthy. So then where is it? Is it dividends? Who is the natural buyer for these?
I think from our perspective, exit, what we think about is the compounders. For us, and this is the big difference with private equity, right? We want to be investors in companies throughout their lifetime, and we want to find the companies that compound. If you think about a Stripe, for example, we've been investors since the seed round, and we continue to invest in every round. So that is those are the companies that we try to find. So we're not super focused on exit, but what I can say is that I think a lot of these companies can go public, particularly if you become the leading player in a services category and start to drive organic growth. And that is a must, because if you don't have that, I don't think you can go public. I think that will be an option.
But go public as a sort of tech-enabled version of whoever is already public in the market?
I think the markets will value it more uniquely. And it's so case by case. So I don't want to speak, maybe I think Dan can talk a little bit about Dwelly. It's super case by case how the exit journey and the public journey of these companies, because you do start, let's say, in accounting services, but then there's so many other products that you can offer to your customers from a financial services perspective. And it's the same thing with Dwelly. They start in real estate agency, but there's so much more they can offer to their customers from a product perspective. So the equity story and the company's journey completely changes throughout that time.
I think that you're creating a new category effectively. And let's put aside for a second all the potential adjacent categories that you can introduce. But I mean, I think probably, again, I think Zeynep and kind of like yourself, you guys better positioned because effectively you have a broader view on different kind of companies and the stage where they are, et cetera, et cetera. And I think especially as the companies start already reaching more into this like growth equity PE kind of side, I think this is where these questions come up more and more. But it feels to me that the core of the question is in fundamentals. Let's look at the business that has 95-97% gross customers retention, 110% net dollar retention because a bit of organic growth, inflation naturally grows, monthly almost subscription-like payment, and operating margin of, let's say, 40%. What do we call these businesses today? B2B SaaS. And they are traded at 7 to 10 multiples of IRR revenue at the point of being public. Effectively, one can argue that these typical B2B SaaS are being eaten by AI pretty much as we speak. Penetration by seed is high, cost of development of producing B2B SaaS is going down every single day. Lovable yesterday kind of raised a crazy successful round at 2 billion, Coursera at 10 billion. It's clearly going down. While kind of the question is on this like business services, who's going to be the one that would replace this end customer relationship ownership that accounting firm, recruitment firm is having with a specific recruiter or kind of a company or the owner of the business? It's very hard to replace. So kind of arguably, I would say that whenever you look at the fundamentals, if you have the fundamentals as such as of the kind of typical SaaS businesses as of today, that arguably I would say even more protected than that of the typical B2B SaaS, then I would kind of assume that these businesses should be traded with a premium compared to where the market today trades the typical B2B SaaS companies. So I think kind of easily you can be talking not just about kind of simple kind of 10 multiples of IRR, but even that with a premium, kind of 15, 20. I believe that it definitely can be done, especially given that you're creating a category, then with all the, I think as Zeynep mentioned, adjacent categories that you can kind of tap into on top of that.
I can add that at Pioneers, we didn't really think much about the exit strategy. If you choose a market that is big enough, you can either go public or be acquired by a large player. If you look at the staffing market specifically, there are some publicly traded companies that make 200 million in annual revenue. We are a little bit over 20 already, so we're not that far away from going public. So it's not that much of a crazy idea to go public at some point. So we decide that we can think about it later. Market is pretty active in terms of M&A, and we'll find a way to get to the point where we find some liquidity event.
First of all, like we don't like too much thinking of exits. I think you need to be focused on building a great business. I think there's always buyers. I think the question is the price, right? And I think the question, and I agree there with Dan and Zeynep, right? At the end of the day, you go back to fundamentals. And fundamentals is people are going to value you based on how much they think you're going to be able to grow and deliver in the next few years. And what's the certainty that that's going to happen? And that's the reality of anyone analyzing and valuing a business. So the organic growth that Zeynep mentioned before, that's the exact key. Like if you're going to be growing at 50% and there's a lot of predictability and a real path of like how you're going to keep on growing at those rates, that's actually what's going to increase your multiple whenever you want to sort of find an exit strategy. By the way, along the way, and depending on sort of the investors, I think like people are getting more and more creative of how you can actually find liquidity, especially in this place that are much more sort of cash heavy. Focus on building a great business is probably what we all need to do. And then once you're there, there's always a buyer, and the price will depend on sort of like what type of businesses you're building.
And as I'm talking now, I was just checking what is Constellation Software worth. That is like almost not growing organically at all, grows primarily by M&A. But the point, I think, David, to yourself, that if you can continuously show every single year that you can add incrementally into your revenue 30-40% every year organically through acquisition, kind of whatever way, Constellation is 80 billion worth business, traded at, I think, close to kind of 40 multiples of kind of EBITDA.
How do you manage a risk of essentially VCs as your partners in the cap table pushing you too hard to blitz scale too fast and run into bad acquisition decisions along the way? How do you handle that?
I think it's the only way. Like if you want to build a tech business, you want to build a high fast-paced growth business, you need to find with people that are actually share your vision and think the same way you think. When you talk to other sources of capital, even if it's family office, it doesn't need to be like sort of private equity, that are not sort of in this world of high pace, moving fast, deploying fast, building product, building technology, transforming. Like if you're not in that game, your conversations are widely different. You should never marry someone that doesn't share the same sort of like vision that you share, right? Like this applies to any sort of partnership. It's basically it's just a natural thing to happen, and I think there's no pressure necessarily. Like if you love moving fast, then you're the right person to be backed by that source of capital. If not, choose a different source of capital, which I think it's also, by the way, like
I love it because the question was about how do you avoid sort of VC pressure, whereas David is here saying, yeah, I want more VC pressure.
I put more pressure on myself. And then it's even worse.
There was a question to us from an investor perspective. What are the differences in the expected MOICs, or to translate that to normal human language, multiples on invested capital that we underwrite in AI roll-ups versus conventional software companies? Do you underwrite them differently from a returns perspective expectation?
It's hard to comment on this. It's super stage related, and it will depend during the journey of the company that we invest in. Because of course, we are at our core, we're early stage investors, we're seed investors. That is the core of what GC does. And when we invest in these companies, typically it is the seed profile. So we don't do money multiples on that, of course. And we don't do that for some time. And I think what's key is that if you think about maybe I can talk about the funding journey of these companies a little bit and that shed light on it. You do need to start with equity capital. Why? Or some kind of capital that's not debt, because you're buying a business and then you're doing transformation. So you don't want to put leverage on that business when you're executing a tech transformation. That puts a lot of stress on the company. So that's how we get started. And then the journey goes on. Then you want to show that, so there are two models, right? One, you buy big company and then you do AI transformation. Two, you start doing small roll-ups. And to be honest, in Europe, it's going to be more of these small roll-up playbook just because the market is more fragmented than the US.
Just fewer sort of ready big targets to buy.
Exactly. Well, that is kind of the opportunity as well, which means that you focus on building a machine where you can consolidate the long tail of the market that actually no one is looking at because it's too messy to acquire anyways. So once you start doing that, also you start with equity, then you can start thinking about the debt options. But the truth is now you're buying them, you built the tech, you're buying them, you need to integrate and deploy the tech. It's still a lot of you're not actually at a point in time, you don't want to put debt on the business then too, because you don't want to have that stress when you're trying to execute all this. I think where that debt starts to work is when you have shown yourself that you can have this consolidation machine on the long tail of the market and you start considering acquisition of bigger targets. Then you start thinking about debt. And the best time to start really thinking about debt is when you're break even at the holdco level. Of course, you do a debt equity, maybe you do a bit of an equity raise because you still don't want to do the leverage that's high. Why? Because you're buying a mid-size asset now and you've never really bought a mid-size asset and digitally transformed it. But you can use partial debt because the rest of the portfolio is actually looking nice. And then for the next acquisition, you will do that. And maybe at that point, actually, you will stop consuming equity unless you want to buy something very large and, there's a leverage threshold. So this is how we think about the funding journey of these companies, and therefore the valuation and the returns at every stage will be different.
So maybe actually to juxtapose this versus, let's say, a pure software play, where what's different here is that obviously adding leverage into the system at the right point in time, right? I mean, leverage can be a catalyst for return improvement, but it's also high octane. So if you, lighten at the wrong point in time, you can have an explosion. But also at some point, at actually a potentially earlier point, maybe by the time of Series A, it actually becomes a self-financing company to some degree, maybe from Series B onward. So you don't need to do Series D and E and F and G and the rest of the alphabet soup. That means less dilution. And so returns as a result from a MOIC perspective, from a VC investor perspective, may actually be very much comparable.
That's right. And we don't even call these seed or A. For us, this is just that we call them the first stage, the second stage, the third stage, because it's just really different for each company. And we can't do comparables. It's super different for each market as well. And I think I would say we're, again, really more focused on building a compounding business or supporting a company to become a compounding business rather than keeping our ownership, making sure we don't get diluted and we drive returns. That's just not what our North Star is as a firm.
Are you seeing any distressed AI assets that can be rolled up? With the given state of software, can software itself become a target for AI roll-ups? What do you guys think?
To me, what is happening at the moment is it's a fundamental value unlocker that never existed ever before. And I think that what we're seeing now is not different from what was happening in the Internet 1.0 era. So I think we just frankly don't know what it would look like. Would it be the cursors of the world on Lovables that would take it on with? Probably what we can say is that on the foundational model level, I think that the guys are creating moat just by kind of the size and the quality of the models, agreed. But I think everything on top, copilots and different kind of RAGs models and everything, to be honest, I think we still yet to see who are the winners in these spaces. And I think that we're yet to see Internet 2.0 wave, Internet 3.0, not sure we're there to judge yet. So I think that back to the question, roll-up of AI assets probably is going to be a bit pricey roll-up today, but let's wait for 1 year. And then I think that it's going to be already much more lucrative type roll-up. And given that, I think this is the last question for anyone in the UK, guys, we're hiring. So please drop a note.
Guys, it was an absolute pleasure to host all of you, and thank you to each of you to take time out of your busy schedule, especially on a Friday night in July, both to our panelists and to our audience. Spend some time talking about the nuts and bolts of building AI rollups. Hopefully we'll do more of these in the future. I want to thank again Zeynep, Dan, David, Leo, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you, guys. And by the way, if you're building an AI rollup, make sure to drop a line to myself and Zeynep somewhere along the way.